So at this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, Mohamed Sioufi from UN Habitat in Nairobi. Mohamed Sioufi has a master's degree in architecture from MIT and a PhD in architecture. I think you have, is it architecture at MIT as well? Yeah, and a PhD in architecture from the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning right here at the University of Michigan. So Dr. Sioufi is, in a sense, coming home to share his experience and his expertise at UN Habitat with us. Mohamed is the coordinator of the Housing and Slum Upgrading Branch. He has over 38 years of experiencing, practicing, advising, and teaching in the field of human settlements. His experiences bridge policy and technical advice, professional practice, academia, policy making, research, and training. Since 1995, he has worked for UN Habitat in capacity development, policy and technical cooperation, and global norms and guidelines for development. Dr. Sioufi initiated Habitat's participatory slum upgrading program, which is operating in more than 40 countries, not only in countries in Africa, but also in the Arab states, the Caribbean, and Pacific regions. So please join me in welcoming Mohamed Sioufi.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everybody. Are you hearing me well at the end of the room? Good. I see some nods, so I can. Frank Sinatra once said he doesn't like to give a lunch speech or a song at lunchtime because people are chewing away and so on. But do enjoy. I'm not going to sing. And I will take you through a presentation on a call for a paradigm shift. What the global housing strategy that I'm coordinating is aiming to do. So we're trying to put housing at the center, and this morning's presentations were an excellent segue to what I'm going to talk about. We've heard a lot about issues and problems, about poverty alleviation through housing, the role of government, and so on and so forth. But there's no silver bullet. There's no real solution that you can say, if we follow this recipe, we are going to succeed. So it's an exploratory. We're going down an exploratory lane, learning from each other and working together. Have a look at what's on the screen, please. So there's about 64 million vacant units in China, 18.4 million vacant in the US after the crash in 2008, 3 million in Egypt, 5 million in Mexico, etc. So there are ghost towns. Ghost towns, and we heard a bit about this in Angola. There are more than 120 million vacant units globally, of which could house 500 million people, and yet we have 863 million people languishing in slums. The supply does not meet the demand. The supply is up there, the demand is here, and we heard quite a bit about this and affordability earlier today. So, a housing strategy, and we've heard also today, to build so many thousand or so many. So how many people have heard about numeric strategies or policies? Show of hands, please. Can you give an example? Yeah?
1 million houses.
Yes. Others? Yeah. 1 million seems to be the golden number, right? Iran has 1 million, China has 75 million, despite the 64 million that they have vacant. So this is what we call, or you would be acquainted with as an output-based strategy. If we talk about development, this is at the thinking of outputs rather than, what's the alternative to an output in development? Okay. So instead of building, we would like to house. Instead of building units, we would like to house households. And this changes from an output-based to a results-based strategy. So we're trying to change, that's part of the paradigm shift, is let us not be numeric, let us be results-based. And while we all know that results-based started in the private sector, it moved to the development world maybe in the 70s with CEDA Canada, and then moved on to Europe, etc. So now, why are we being selfish and keeping this magic approach to ourselves and not giving it to the government? So the idea is that governments would move into that modality of thinking. Let's be results-based. Let's not just build, as in Angola, and you stay for a whole year, then you have to subsidize and give away, etc., etc. So this is how we'd like to see our strategies, that they could be numeric, but they should be results-based. So we need to house people rather than to build houses. Why do we need it? We all know about the economic meltdown, the commodification of housing, limited access to affordable housing, social exclusion, the ghettos and the gated communities, environmental degradation, urban sprawl and environmental pressures, proliferation of slums, informal settlements. So what are the goals of the global housing strategy? We aim to achieve one of the important pillars of the Habitat Agenda, adequate shelter for all. We are contributing to the MDG of 7D of slums, improving the living conditions of over 100 million slum dwellers by 2020. And we're doing this by proposing a paradigm shift in housing. We would like to place housing at the center. So placing housing at the center, so the global strategy promotes a paradigm shift to achieve the adequate shelter for all goal by placing housing at the center of our thinking, our policies, and our cities. So who will be involved? We would like to have development habitat agenda partnerships through what we are calling national habitat committees. We had those for Habitat 2, those of you who know about Habitat 2 in Istanbul in 1996. We're having our next Habitat 3 in 2016, and they're every 20 years. It's like Rio Plus 20 that you've just had earlier. So this is the Habitat, or the Urban Global Summit. We would like central and local authorities, academia, the private sector, civil society, development partners to come together and address the issues of housing. So the strategy aims to develop national and city housing strategies. It's a participatory process that guides policies, planning, and programming of housing and slum upgrading and prevention interventions. And the national and city housing strategies are inseparable from inclusive urban planning and management processes. So what guides us? There is a demand. We heard a lot about demand and pent-up demand and so on. So what are the sustainable housing components? Yes, let's be a bit interactive. I get fidgety when I stand behind the lectern. So how do you, what are the prerequisites of housing? What do you need to develop housing? Yes, thank you. What else? But before that, before building, what are the prerequisites before you build? Money, thank you. Yes, finance. Perfect. Yes. You're good. Maybe you can continue. Go ahead. Building, labor, yeah, but before that? With the land, what do you need? Permits, yes. What else? What do you do first thing in the morning when you wake up? Water, yes, you need infrastructure. So if you need serviced land, you need finance. These are sort of the prerequisites. What a lot of people said, we need buildings, we need to put something there. You need design. So you need design, you need the construction technologies and materials and labor. Right? We all agree on this? You said it, right? Okay, thank you very much for putting us in a housing box. So this is the box of thinking of ministries of housing, of local authorities, that if we have land, infrastructure, money, we can do housing. And we've seen that, and we've seen the ghost town. So what went wrong? We would like to zoom out of the housing box and look at some other prerequisites at national and local level. So in this case, Someone mentioned something earlier, but what would we need at national level for housing to be more successful, to be more effective, to be developed in a better way? What are the national prerequisites? Employment, yes. What else? Sorry? Planning, yes. So you need a national urban policy, you need urban economy, you need national legislation. These set the scene for a better housing program. At the city level, what would we need? This creates the enabling environment, right? At city level, what else would create the enabling environment? Institutions, what do they do? Transportation, yeah. Inspectors to inspect what? But you would build based on? Plans, yes, thank you. Urban plans, local economic development, and local legislation. A lot of the housing box that I mentioned earlier boxes the thinking into land and housing and infrastructure and building and so on. And a lot of it does not work because it's not based on a solid planning approach. You have all these isolated housing in Tehran. They built, they have 100 million houses. You can have like 100,000 houses 70 kilometers outside the city. No one wants to go there, even though they're nearly given for free, very heavily subsidized. Because they're not based on a planning. They're also numeric based. We want to deliver so many, but we don't care how the people are going to access, how they're going to live, and so on. Another forgotten element is the post-construction, and that's the tenure types, and we talked a bit about security of tenure. There was an interesting presentation that security of tenure in the rural is not number one. However, in urban, we do think it's very important. Also governance and management and maintenance. Then, of course, we learn lessons and we improve what we do. Any questions on this model? Any challenges? Yes? First challenge.
Why only urbanization? What if it's a global housing strategy? What about housing in rural areas?
Mostly housing in rural is not that complex because it is usually isolated, it's related to the land, ideally not utilizing agricultural land. But the complexities are much easier. You can dig your own well, etc., etc. It's less sparse, it's more sparse, it's less dense, and so on and so forth. The actual problems do appear in urban settings. And now more than 50% of the world have moved to cities. You know that urban poverty is much harsher than rural. In the rural area, you can go and drink from a stream or pull up some grass or whatever. In the city, you're dealing with harsh surfaces, concrete, cement, asphalt, and you cannot find your water. You have to pay for everything is commodified, and you have to pay for it. So you have to take care about the living environment in urban much more than in the rural context. Okay, so we're talking about different themes: planning, economy, housing types, indigenous peoples, gender, slum upgrading, affordability, and sustainability. There are cross-cutting issues, the housing rights, and we heard quite a bit today about rights and rights of women and the disparities between gender, environment, gender, and youth. These are cross-cutting, so we like to see them interacting with all the different themes, but they also have their own think tank and their own zone in this process. The approach, we're looking at exchanging experiences, applied evidence-based research, effectiveness through scale, efficiency through partnerships, and national local capacity development. So what is the global housing strategy? What is our approach? As mentioned, we would like to have the key actors to be involved, the central local authorities, the private sector, civil society, academia, and the development partners. And as the crash of 2008 occurred, it also impacted on us at the UN, maybe even more dramatically. A lot of the luxuries that we had, having the conferences and bringing 4,000 people or 200 people or 500 people to discuss issues, is no longer there. It's also not sustainable in terms of environment. So we are trying to be a bit innovative and to move away from the classic type of This type of workshop is important because brains come together, but if you want to disseminate and to expand more with larger numbers, it gets economically and environmentally unsustainable. So we would like them to, and people know in their own setting their challenges and their needs. So we would like to see how do they identify their challenges for each of the themes that I mentioned. So who is on LinkedIn here? LinkedIn? Okay. Who knows about crowdsourcing? Crowdsourcing? Fund sourcing? Okay. So we're trying to crowdsource information, so mass outreach, sharing the social and professional media. LinkedIn is one of these important ones, although people get jobs through that, but they also have a lot of discussions, professional discussions. And so that's a good medium for information exchange. Analyzing that and gives us information management. And of course, we don't forget the applied research, a lot of what we heard about the last couple of days for real knowledge management. This gives us a series of responses that the Global Housing Strategy would like to twin with the challenges. So you can throw out the questions and get a lot of responses there. A quick example. Fannie Mae, who knows Fannie Mae? Freddie Mac's? Yes. In 2008, they repossessed 18 point something million housing units in this country. And to make right for their sins, they had a brilliant idea last year, a year away from now, August last year, which I read on the internet. And basically what they did is they decided, because the housing stock that was stagnating in their possession, they went to a private sector firm and tried to give 2,500 units to the private sector to rent out rather than sell. This, for me, is a brilliant paradigm shift from the capital of capitalism that thinks on ownership to rental. So this paradigm shift, this is a gem of a thought. And it's a one-liner, rent instead of sell. And this is very easy to exchange on the internet. These gems of ideas, and every country has their own intelligentsia. You just need to trigger the thought that people are thinking about this. What about renting instead of selling, since you're unable to sell? In the case of Luanda, you're stuck with all these, and then you keep on subsidizing the apartments. But rather, let's change paradigm, let's change. So these types of exchanges would be very useful in this type of crowdsourcing and exchange of information. So we would like to see this happening in all the themes. It's like working around the clock, not forgetting that we're looking at the different cross-cutting issues. So one particular case, of course, is the case of the slums. And for a moment, I would like to explore what's happening in the case of the slums in the model that I just... what makes slums happen? Slums happen, but why? Yes? But why do they go to the slum? Why don't they go and rent an apartment or buy an apartment? Okay, but then who's at fault here? Genesis of slums, please. Poverty, yeah? Lack of employment. Lack of enough housing, exactly. So there's a failure somewhere. There's a failure in terms of the national housing policy and failure in urban economy and in national legislation, urban planning, local economic development. And in the UN, we've defined slums with 5 deprivations. You must have heard about them, but basically you have access to water and sanitation, so that's a failure in basic service delivery. Security of tenure, so land is not available at affordable costs. The legislation does not allow the access. Tenure types are restrictive or expensive. Adequate housing, that's the building materials, technologies, and construction. Overcrowding is the 5th, or crowdedness, and that is where the design has failed. And overarching, a lot of people mentioned the jobs and so on, so you don't have the finances, the resources. And once the whole system is failing, you really cannot claim that there would be good governance or good management and maintenance. So the whole system has failed in this case. The public sector, the municipality, local, central government, etc., have failed to address the needs of the lower income groups, of the new migrants that are coming to the city. So yesterday, and I borrowed these slides from our colleagues, yesterday we saw in the case of South Africa how unemployment has risen, and obviously this is poverty due to high unemployment rates. And the solution that we saw were government transfers, where there were improvements in the multidimensional model of poverty alleviation. There has been improvements as a result of the government transfers. There's a lot of discussion about subsidies and they create a dependency system and so on, and is that the strategic way? We saw in Luanda that building houses that did not give the political outcome that they wanted, which is the loyalty of the people that are receiving these handouts, if you will, or housing. So we would like to talk a little bit about economic investment versus housing subsidies. Housing subsidies in general create a dependency on subsidies. There's a lack of dignity, no return on subsidies. Can give you a good example. We used to, at UN Habitat for many years, we used to quote certain countries in Northern Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, for their huge housing programs. And yet this is where the Arab Spring started. It does, I'm pleased to hear the Luanda case, because it does reinforce the theory that we're thinking, or the hypothesis, is that giving housing does not solve the problem. People will live without dignity, people are dependent on the government for handouts and so on, and therefore the whole thing of clientelism and so on doesn't work. And the funding that you're putting in subsidies is lost. You're losing it forever, because you're putting it in a concrete building, you give it to someone, the person will not be able to pay back. These are lost investments. They're not investments, they're subsidies that are lost. So we are advocating for investing in urban economy, income generation, not only urban but in jobs. This empowers citizens to access housing, not only housing but health, education, and so on. Because you saw the case of South Africa, where you have about 8 or so depreciations that you are addressing through different types of subsidies. If you get an income, you don't need to go that route. You access in housing with dignity, you reduce the dependency, and most importantly, there are returns on the investment. So it's a revolving investment in the economy. How about the vulnerable people? The Société d'Habitation du Québec made very interesting impact studies on the impact of social housing on the economy and on people's lives and so on. And again, we heard a bit of that. So according to their study, 20% of healthcare costs can be attributed to poverty and inequality. This is now in Quebec, of course. And for example, if you take into action homelessness, action on homelessness reduces the need for emergency care or psychiatric services. It costs at least twice as much to ignore the homeless than that's a typo, than to stabilize them by providing both social housing and social support. In fact, John Mackay, who was handling the Société in Quebec, argued in Parliament that since we are building social housing, we are reducing the incidence of respiratory diseases and others, you need to transfer part of the budget that goes to health to come to social housing. So a lot of people around the table here have been talking about health and the impact of health on human improvement and human development. And definitely social housing would be... now this contradicts what I was just saying earlier, that you should not do subsidies. No, we have to reconciliate the two. So while we do have this model, we still have to do, but we need to minimize our interventions for affordability. Someone mentioned earlier the mortgage access to funding and maybe subsidized funding. That's a good place to put your subsidies. And you should be targeting most of all the vulnerable. By doing that, you're reducing the lost funding. The case of Angola is a double whammy. They built those houses very expensive, and then they couldn't sell them, so they reduced the cost. And then they couldn't sell them, so they had to subsidize the people to access. So all these subsidies are a cumulative type of subsidy. What about if they had put that money in creating jobs that are paying a decent salary that would make these people eventually access housing on the free market? At the end of the day, the budget of a certain city or a country, it's a closed loop, it's a sack of money. And whether you give now a little bit for food and a little bit for housing, a little bit for education, a little bit for health, etc., why not create proper jobs, give proper salaries, minimum wages, and that is going to grow, that's going to create a growth, because whatever is being produced is going to come back to the investors. Easier said than done, I know, it's a big challenge. Okay, so to start talking about these ideas, we have a media strategy. We are trying to outreach to people through the popular and professional outreach, participatory advocacy, professional and key Habitat Agenda partner inputs, political buy-in, and partnerships with Habitat Agenda partners. So we are on the Urban Gateway. We have a group there, about 2,780 plus members. There we are doing networking and boosting website membership to advocate for for the concepts we are talking about. LinkedIn, we are on more than 90 groups, and we are outreaching to 600,000 professionals. Yesterday there was, and so that's popular and professional outreach. Yesterday there was a very passionate discussion about let's collaborate together, let's work together. How can the research institutes across countries work together? I think there's a lot of potential in social media. You can create your own group with the several universities that are collaborating. There could be a rich exchange of papers and discussions, webinars, etc. It's not very expensive, it doesn't cost anything. It's only the dedication and the time. So there is a lot of potential. We're toying around with this concept. We're toying around and trying to experiment more and more the utilization of these new technologies, and how do we outreach and how do we become more effective at a lesser cost. And also, of course, it's environmentally very appealing. This is a quotation. Give you a second to read it. Maybe I should read for those who are far. Housing is a much more serious issue deep inside everyone's ambitions. I say, housing is the foundation of a sustainable society. Any guess as who could have said this quotation? Good try. That's for Habitat for Humanity, not UN Habitat, but he would say something like that. Any other ideas? You don't need to say the name, but what type of a partner would that be? You mentioned a prominent politician and ex-president. Any ideas? Kofi Annan, no, Secretary General of the UN, okay. Surprise, surprise, it's a youth, an Ethiopian youth, on Facebook. I provoke you by showing this because we all thought it was a prominent person, a personality. We always disregard youth and their thinking, but they do have profound wisdom. They also are looking forward to have a house, they're looking forward to settle, etc. And therefore, one of the things we're also trying to get on Facebook and to address another population of potential housing clients in the future, right? Okay, on LinkedIn, we also have our own group, Global Housing Strategy. It was called 2025. We had that as a target, and then we said, let's keep it open because different countries have different rates of development, and let's not restrict. So we took off the 2025. LinkedIn would not allow me to change the logo, so we're stuck with the, with the logo there. But there we have over 1,000 members, and we use that to actually through the 90 groups, the 600,000 people, when we advertise, we were developing our Global Housing Strategy framework document, and we got feedback through questionnaires and like this one testing whether whether it's very much needed or whether it's something is happening to the pointer, but whether it's not needed or so. Most of the responses come here, and then at the bottom we have an open-ended question, and that also enriches the inputs with what we've forgotten or need to introduce or include. Another quotation, I'm not going to quiz you here, but this is from one of our donors from Norway. They are funding Habitat's work, and he has realized that, or mentioned in one of our meetings, that the global housing strategy is of relevance for everyone, and that means the North and the South. And he gave the example that in Norway they've been providing housing for the youth outside the city. The youth responded with their feet, they walked away, they did not move there, because they wanted to be in town near the discos, near where the city life is. And so it is also a problem in the North as much as it is in the South. Maybe less, but it still is an issue. So this is political and development partnership, partner support. On our LinkedIn group, we have people like Barry Pinsky, who is heading Rooftops International, working a lot in Eastern and Southern Africa on housing finance and others. Here he is asking for manuals, case studies, and other materials. So that's the type of exchange that you could get on the social media at absolutely no cost. We shipped him some, we emailed him some of those documents that he's asking for. The gentleman, Jason, at the bottom is giving instructions. There are 3 actions: you decommodify 30% of housing, and you restructure city finances away from property taxes, etc. So there is this rich exchange that can happen in the social media. So a little bit on housing criteria. In terms of urban planning and design, we are advocating to locate housing within the urban areas and not isolated remote dormitory towns or cities, including housing in mixed urban use areas, improve mobility by introducing a rich variety of urban uses, and to promote cultural viability and street life. Quick example, the Tehran case, why are all these vacant houses, these ghost towns? We asked the Ministry of Housing, why aren't people coming to your new construction? They're very pleased. They build 19-story buildings. They are seismic resistant, very well built, marble entrances, elevators, the works. And people don't go because it's 70 kilometers outside the city. So they're saying, no, the people are coming. But it's been lying there for 5 years. Okay, anyway. You talk to the people, and they say, okay, the poor person, a hairdresser in a hairdresser's salon, comes and says, okay, I'm given the flat nearly for free, but I can't afford to commute the 70 kilometers, time-wise and money-wise. Mexico City takes 3 hours, they have the same thing on the periphery, it takes 3 hours to commute from the new housing to the center of the city. People buy it, they get a mortgage, they pay for it, but it is the retirement plan. For 20, 30 years, these apartments will remain empty, and people are paying for them. They're not given for free, but it's a waste of resources. There's always a need for housing, and then people are not accessing. So there's a mismatch. It's again numeric, it's output-oriented, it's not results-based. Okay, so the hairdresser now says, I work in a salon in downtown Tehran, and I can't commute these 70, I can't afford it. But can you imagine that this hairdresser working in the salon has to travel daily? The person living in the same housing has to go and get his haircut in downtown Tehran because there's no hairdressers in the extensions. So they've been designed solely one use, zoning restrictions, and they don't work. They're not viable in terms of an urban element. So that's on the design. Economic opportunities, as mentioned, well, of course we know that housing does produce jobs, but if, like in the case of Luanda, you build, you create jobs, but then you are unable to market your output or your product, then you have a problem of subsidies again. Include housing with mixed uses to generate new jobs, income generating opportunities, encourage private sector to invest in housing in the mixed use areas. Introduce urban agriculture for job creation, food production security, improved urban environmental qualities, and share land value to introduce solutions to finance and to cross-subsidize. For example, the ministry says we built out 70 kilometers because the land belongs to us, so the cost of land in the housing is minimized, and that takes us to the low-cost element. So you can challenge that by saying, well, if you build in the center of the, they of course forget that there's a transport cost. And if you want it to work, you would have to introduce your metro line or your public transit systems. The cost of that is never added to the lowering of the cost by building outside. So the full, and a lot of your economists here, the full life cycle amortization over 20 years or so, and taking into account the other investments that will have to be put because the land was cheap. But for it to work, you're going to have to put a lot of investments. On the other hand, if you are building in downtown, land is very expensive, we know that. But there could be land value sharing. So if you're giving the first 3-4 stories for public investment and banks and businesses, they could absorb the cost of the land, and the housing on top of that might be alleviated from the cost of the land. And so you can have this, what we call value sharing or cross subsidies that happen between the housing and the economic activities. Social integration, again, most of these extensions of the cities are done mono-use and mono-social group. So it's either the rich or the poor, or etc. So you need to address that through improved tenure security, because that improves a bit the living conditions of people and their security. Encouraging social interaction, different income groups go away from the ghettos and the gated communities, and ensure that housing proposals are gender responsive. We heard an interesting study earlier, how in Ghana there is a difference in terms of tenure and in terms of the rights to buy, to sell, to rent, etc. Environmental improvement, achieve neighborhood environmental sustainability, improve microclimate through green architecture and planning approaches, improve the microclimate also through vegetation, preferably again, urban agriculture, productive types of plants rather than just decorative, and with different urban elements and furniture. Criteria, governance, and partnership. Produce housing through partnerships with all the key actors that I mentioned earlier, central, local authorities, academia, private sector, civil society, and the development partners. No one institution, no one group can do it on their own. And that has been proven. When the government attempts, they never reach enough numbers. When the private sector, again, it doesn't work alone. So you need a combination of actors, and you need a combination of approaches to tackle the problem for all the different social levels that we're talking about. Encourage the corporate social responsibility to subsidize housing for vulnerable groups. We would like to introduce what we call academic social responsibility. And by academic social responsibility, a lot of you, the relationship and the partnerships that you're having here between universities in the north and the south, some students go to the south, spend a semester or 3-4 weeks in what they call a reality studio or a field trip or a field studio. Now that has its benefits, but can you imagine if all the students in academia in a country were to devote 1 semester or 1 year of their education to serve the community, and still do it as part of education? So rather than designing the fictitious school on a fictitious site, why not design a school for the community? This could be done for free, under the supervision of the staff and the professors. You can guarantee the quality, and for sure you're going to be serving the community, learning more, being more realistic in your education package. And just think about that untapped resource, all these young brains, and change the relationship between academia, the local authorities, and central government. There's always, oh, these are up there in their white towers, etc., ivory towers or whatever you call them, and the relationship is not that healthy. You don't have the time to waste. We need to really change things on the ground, and I think that would help us move forward. In that vein, we are introducing an international competition, urban revitalization of mass housing. In many countries, also in the north a lot, and the Eastern Bloc, ex-Soviet Union, the countries in transition, there's a lot of mass housing. A lot of it was built in the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of it is in 70s, and at this point in time, it's a historic moment to look at those and to address them, rather than let them decay and follow. Oops, I have to postpone. It's our timekeeper, I guess. Okay, so we have several partners here. We have the Union of International Architects, Slum Dwellers International, Urban Futures. The city of Medellin is also going to sponsor one of the prizes. This is the poster. We're basically looking at what I've been talking about, those isolated, this is in Turkey, this is in China, that you have this mass housing with absolutely desolate open spaces, no use for those, and the social, economic, environmental problems that we know about. So what are the challenges in mass housing? The location is usually, as I mentioned, isolated in peripheral areas, mono-use. In some cases, in the older versions, they now are on prime land in the center. Many of the cities that have those want to displace the people because the land has appreciated in value, it's underutilized. Residents, in the case of the farther away housing situations, they commute to access the daily needs. There's urban sprawl, large environmental footprint, inflexible prefabricated houses. If you need to annex a room or to expand, you cannot, because these are concrete walls that you cannot, that are inflexible. Open spaces are usually neglected, underutilized, unsafe. There's a lot of deterioration due to poor management, social segregation, ghettoization. Also the populations, many of these public housing were built for factory workers in the 60s, 70s. Now these people have retired. Physically they need better access, so a lot of these are walk-ups, or they were, in Germany they're going to spend like $4 billion just to rehabilitate the houses to make them accessible for the elderly. A lot of these, as architects, you like to put the split level and little steps taking you up or down, and the elevator comes at the middle of the landing. So this is not accessible. So you need to rehabilitate all this. Social ills such as drug trafficking, gangs, etc., and low-cost construction is usually very high in consumption, because in the government's strive to reduce the cost, they build with very cheap materials. Our colleagues from South Africa were saying that some of these houses that were built in the 90s are now crumbling because they saved a bit on the construction costs and so on. So saving money in the short run and the long run is not really a saving. Who is eligible? Well, these are graduate students as well as recent graduates after December 31st of 2010. And ideally, we are aiming at multidisciplinary teams. We would like the teams to go out and talk to the local institutions. So together with the municipality or Ministry of Housing, select a housing locality, so that it's really more of a development type competition rather than just an architecture or a planning competition. We would like those who've graduated to go back to academia and to do some research and to look at best practices. Including the private sector, because they might, for the development of economic possibilities, revitalization of the economy, job creation, etc., and civil society as the watchdog organizations for owners, associations, and rights groups. The design criteria, very quickly, it's reflecting the criteria that we mentioned, so improving the quality of urban space, economic stimulation by introducing economic activities and sharing the land value, as I mentioned. The social integration, addressing mobility through improved tenure security and environmental improvements, as I mentioned, as well as the governance, where you're initiating the dialogue with the key actors, and the partnerships, which are encouraging the corporate social responsibility, academic social responsibility. And I also heard recently that there's something called professional social responsibility, whereby an architect or a planner's office would dedicate some time to do pro bono work for the community. So the competition is to look at, basically we have a research component. It started in September, but it's due in mid-January. So there's a national urban and housing analysis, as well as identifying best practices and the challenges within the housing compound. Then we move to the proposals, which are more innovative solutions, sustainable solutions to the case study that they have selected. And more importantly, we would like them to zoom out of those with concepts and policy implications that could be easily exchanged, like the example I gave about Fannie Mae and renting. So once you've done the theme and the scheme on the ground, you would want to come out with some of the ideas. Finally, we'll have a national jury, regional jury, and international jury. We would like the juries to reflect the multiplicity of viewpoints. So we would like academia, professionals, NGOs, and institutions to be represented there at each level, the national, the regional, and the international. We have our website where you can go and read more about it, promote it with your students. We are also promoting already some crowdsourcing by exchanging. So the professors that are putting it in their curriculum. We have about 75 countries that have joined already, and in more than 115 cities. So they're uploading we are uploading for them their dissertations, their publications. So that would also be an international experience of learning and exchanging already the knowledge that is there, as well as later on, once the results are out, there will be more exchanges. This is the website, masshousingcompetition.org. Back to the global housing strategy. So what are our expected outcomes? We are ending now. We would like to reposition housing within the global contemporary debate. Some of the key outcomes, we would like the policies, the strategies to be rights-based, gender-responsive, and results-based strategies. Inclusive cities, access to adequate housing for all. A paradigm shift. Housing is part of urban planning. It's not an isolated sector. Systemic reforms promoted for improved quality of life. Linkages of housing with the economy, as mentioned, and sustainable building and neighborhood designs and technologies promoted. So the timeline is, and this is my last slide, in 2013, we had our framework approved in our governing council, so it's an official document and it's now translated to the official six UN languages. In 2014, we are going to have a couple of activities, reporting and exchanges between countries. This is in our World Urban Forum. It's taking place in Medellin in April. 2015, we have a next governing council. We report there again. And more importantly, we are also trying to influence the thinking on the MDGs and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, in their formulation and in the way they're going to be developed in the next couple of years. And 2016, we have our Habitat 3, as I mentioned earlier, where we're going to discuss the agenda for urbanization and urban development and housing. And we continue on the implementation. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm here for any questions. Thank you.